There is something uniquely disturbing about a house that looks completely normal from the outside. The cars in the driveway, the lights left on, the post piling up by the door. Everything arranged exactly as it would be if the family inside had simply stepped out for the afternoon and would be back any moment. Except they would not be back, because inside that house, something had happened that no neighbor walking past on a quiet French street could have imagined. Something so deliberate, so calculated, and so complete that it would take investigators weeks just to understand the full shape of what they were dealing with. The Flactif family did not disappear gradually. They did not vanish one by one over time. They were erased. All 6 of them. A father, a mother, and 4 children. Gone from their home in the French Alps in the spring of 2003, leaving behind a silence so total that it took the outside world nearly 3 weeks to notice. This is the story of what happened to the Flactif family. And more than that, it is the story of who made it happen and why, and how a crime this catastrophic was carried out so quietly that an entire neighborhood went about its daily life without knowing what was sitting behind that ordinary front door. The Flactif family lived in Le Champ-sur-Drac, a small commune in the Isère department of southeastern France, not far from Grenoble. It was the kind of town where people knew their neighbors, where children played outside, where a family of 6 going about their daily life was unremarkable precisely because everything about them seemed ordinary. Xavier Flactif was 36 years old. He was, by profession, a real estate agent. Ambitious, energetic, the kind of man who threw himself into business with the confidence of someone who expected things to go his way. He was not universally liked by some accounts. There were people in his professional world who found him abrasive. People who felt he had taken advantage of them in deals. People who, when his name came up, had something sharp to say. But to his family, he was a father and a husband. He had 4 children with his partner, Graziella Ortega. The children were young. The oldest was 11. The youngest was just 4 years old. Graziella was 34. She was described by those who knew her as warm and devoted to her children. The kind of mother whose world organized itself around her family. The 6 of them lived together in their home. And in the spring of 2003, all 6 of them were killed. The first sign that something was wrong was not dramatic. It was mundane. It was the kind of thing that accumulates slowly before anyone thinks to act on it. The children stopped appearing at school. Xavier stopped showing up to work. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were not returned. In a city, this might go unnoticed for longer. But in a small commune, absence is noticed. People talk. Neighbors observe. And by late April of 2003, enough people had noticed enough absences that someone finally decided to do more than wonder. Authorities were contacted. A welfare check was requested. Officers went to the house. What they found when they gained entry to the property was not the scene of an obvious crime. There were no signs of a violent struggle visible from the doorway. The house was, in many respects, intact, but the family was not there, and the state of the house, examined more carefully, told a story that no innocent explanation could account for. The Flactif family had been missing for approximately 3 weeks before anyone looked through that door. 3 weeks in which life in Le Champ-sur-Drac had continued normally, and in which 6 people were simply absent from the world without anyone raising a sufficient alarm. That 3-week gap would become one of the most troubling aspects of the entire case. French investigators moved quickly once the alarm was raised. The immediate question was not simply where the family had gone. It was what had happened inside that house. Because the more carefully forensic teams examined the property, the clearer it became that something serious had taken place within those walls. There were traces, not obvious ones, not the kind of evidence that announces itself, but the kind that careful, methodical forensic work brings to the surface. Evidence that the house had been cleaned, thoroughly, deliberately cleaned. Evidence that someone had put considerable effort into removing the signs of what had happened there. That effort at concealment told investigators something important. This was not impulsive. This was not a crime of sudden rage that left chaos in its wake. This was planned. This was organized. Someone had thought carefully about what needed to be done afterward and had acted on that thinking. The bodies of the family had been removed from the house. All 6 of them, transported somewhere by someone and hidden. Finding them became the central task of the investigation. Investigators worked outward from the house. They interviewed neighbors, colleagues, anyone connected to Xavier's professional life. They built a picture of who the Flactif family were, who moved in their orbit, and who might have had reason to want them gone. Xavier's work in real estate had generated friction. There were business disputes. There were deals that had not ended well for other parties. There were people who, by their own acknowledgement, had grievances against him. But grievances are not murders. And the scale of what had happened here went far beyond a business dispute that had turned personal. 6 people were dead, including 4 children, the youngest of whom was 4 years old. The investigation eventually led authorities to the French Alps, to a remote area in the mountains not far from where the family had lived. And there, in that isolated terrain, investigators found what they had been looking for. The bodies of all 6 members of the Flactif family were recovered. They had been transported from the house and concealed in the wilderness. All 6 had been killed. The manner of their deaths confirmed what the forensic evidence at the house had already suggested. This was deliberate. This was systematic. This was carried out by someone who had made a decision to eliminate not just Xavier Flactif, but every person under his roof, including the children. That detail landed on the investigation and on the public with the full weight of what it meant. This was not a crime where children had been harmed incidentally as the tragic byproduct of something else. The children had been killed as part of the plan. All 4 of them, age 4, 6, 9, and 11. The investigation did not take long to produce a primary suspect. And when it did, the profile that emerged was not what most people might have expected from a crime of this scale. Pascal Jardin was not a career criminal. He was not a man with a history of violence. He was, professionally, someone who had worked in Xavier Flactif's orbit, someone who had done business with him, someone who had, over the course of that business relationship, developed a grievance that grew into something far beyond what any ordinary grievance becomes. The details of the dispute between Jardin and Flactif centered on money, on a business deal that Jardin believed had gone badly for him due to Xavier's actions. The exact nature of the financial loss and the extent to which Xavier was actually responsible for it became a matter of significant legal scrutiny during the subsequent proceedings. But what is clear is that Pascal Jardin did not simply feel wronged. He became consumed by it. The grievance, over time, hardened into something else, something that moved from anger and resentment into planning, into deliberate, step-by-step preparation for what he intended to do. He did not act alone. That was the other detail that emerged as the investigation deepened. Jardin had recruited help. He had brought others into the plan. The execution of 6 people and the subsequent concealment of their bodies was not a one-man operation. It required coordination. It required people who were willing to participate in something monstrous in exchange for whatever Jardin had offered them. The network around Jardin was gradually unpicked by investigators. The full scope of who knew what and who participated in which aspects of the crime became the complex, layered subject of one of the most significant criminal trials in modern French history. Pascal Jardin and several co-defendants were brought to trial. The proceedings drew enormous public attention in France, not simply because of the scale of the crime, but because of the nature of it. The deliberate killing of 4 children in addition to their parents represented a depth of calculation that was difficult for people to process. At trial, the evidence against Jardin was substantial. The forensic evidence from the house, the physical evidence connecting him and his associates to the transportation and concealment of the bodies, the financial records that established the grievance and the timeline of its escalation, the testimony of witnesses who had been connected to the planning or the aftermath. Jardin did not emerge from the trial as someone who had been driven to an act of passion by unbearable circumstances. He emerged as someone who had made a series of deliberate decisions over a period of time, had organized and resourced those decisions, and had carried them out in a way that demonstrated premeditation at every stage. He was convicted. He received the maximum sentence available under French law. His co-defendants received sentences reflective of their respective roles in what had been a coordinated and planned operation. The families of the victims received something that many families in cases like this never receive: legal resolution, a named perpetrator, a conviction, a sentence. It did not, of course, give them back what had been taken. Nothing could do that. But it closed the legal chapter of the case in a way that, for all the horror of the crime, at least answered the question of who was responsible and why. Resolved cases are not always the ones that sit easiest with people. There's a particular kind of discomfort that comes from a case where all the facts are established, where there is a conviction and a sentence, and where the only thing left to feel is the full, undiminished weight of what happened. The Flactif case is one of those cases. There is no mystery here in the conventional sense. There is no missing piece. There is no unanswered question about who is responsible. Pascal Jardin killed the Flactif family over a business dispute. He planned it, organized it, and carried it out with a coldness that the trial laid bare in detail. What the case leaves behind is something harder than a mystery. It leaves behind the question of how a human being arrives at that decision. How a grievance, even a serious one, even a financially devastating one, becomes the justification in someone's mind for the deaths of 6 people, 4 of whom were children who had no part in any business dispute, 4 of whom had done nothing to Pascal Jardin and understood nothing of the calculation that had decided their fates. That question does not have a satisfying answer. Courts can establish guilt. Sentences can reflect severity. But the interior of a mind that decides 4 children must die because of a property transaction is not a place that legal proceedings can fully illuminate. And perhaps that is the most disturbing thing about this case. Not the mystery of the unknown, but the horror of the known. The fact that this happened not in darkness or confusion, but in calculation. Step by step, decision by decision. Le Champ-sur-Drac is a small town. The house where the Flactif family lived still stands, as houses do, indifferent to what happened inside them. The mountains where the bodies were found are still there, as mountains are. The children who never returned to school would be young adults today. The oldest would be in his early 30s. The youngest would be in her mid-20s. They would have grown up, as children do, into people with their own lives and their own particular ways of moving through the world. They did not get that, because a man with a grievance decided they should not. What the Flactif case asks of anyone who engages seriously with it is not just the horror of the crime itself, but the recognition of what that crime represents. It represents the end point of something that started as ordinary human bitterness and traveled, through decisions that were made one at a time, to a place of absolute and irreversible darkness. It is a reminder that the distance between a dispute and a catastrophe is not always as long as we tell ourselves it is, and that the people who pay the highest price for that distance are sometimes people who never even knew the dispute existed. 6 people, a house in the French Alps, a silence that lasted 3 weeks before anyone looked through the door. And behind that door, the full cost of one man's decision to let a grievance become something it should never have been allowed to become.